So welcome back to the second part of this Sibo video. If you haven't watched the first part, I'll leave a link below, but I do strongly recommend you watch that before moving on to this video. So what I want to cover in this video is looking at the treatment of Sibo, and this is what I did to clear my Sibo. So this isn't any medical advice. Please do your own research before you start taking any supplementations, or speak to your doctor if you want to get other advice on treatment and kind of protocols. But for this, I'm going to show you what I did and how I worked this protocol and how I worked it over a number of months, really. The thing to remember about Sibo is it's something that's very, very hard to get rid of. When I initially did this, it took me 3 attempts to actually remove my Sibo. The first time I did it, I just did a pure functional protocol, and unfortunately my Sibo came back. And the second time I did it, I actually used some antibiotics, which made a big difference. But again, my Sibo did come back. So it's a tricky thing to talk about because there isn't one sort of solid answer to what's going to fix your Sibo. You might be an unlucky person that finds that they do several protocols and they still have Sibo. So bear that in mind when you are looking at it, and that's where the testing can be quite important that I talked about on the previous video. Although it's a bit of a pain, it gives you an indication of whether you've removed your Sibo or not, or at least whether you've reduced some of the hydrogen or the methane producing bacteria, which again give you an indication of where you are in your stage. So for this, let's talk about the treatment. Let's talk about some post-treatment and interventions. So the treatment itself, like I mentioned, is either going to be a functional treatment or you're going to use some antibiotics. And I'll talk about that on the next slide. The post-treatment is going to be looking at ways of actually rebuilding our gut. Now, if we have used antibiotics, they've fundamentally destroyed all our bacteria, so we actually need to rebuild. So we might be using some probiotics, we might be using some things like aloe vera, some things like bone broth, good things that help us nutritionally build up our gut and our microbiome. And interventions are going to include things like, for example, HCl or hydrochloric acid, because as we mentioned in the first video, our stomach acid is really, really important to prevent us from actually getting Sibo in the first place. Now, lots of people that have Sibo get reoccurring bouts of Sibo again, like I did. So it's important to make sure that even if you think you've stopped your symptoms or you feel really good, is that you carry on at least periodically taking things like HCl, digestive enzymes, even using certain probiotics to help keep that Sibo at bay. And that's another important step. So your treatment is going to be dependent on the types of gases that you have got present. Now, for me, I had a hydrogen-based Sibo, and I decided to go down the antibiotic route, and this was because it was my third attempt in doing this, and the 2 functional treatments hadn't worked for me. Now, that said, a lot of the times when you're looking at these treatments, you'll find that people often recommend going down the functional route because it's long-term benefits over kind of overall, I guess, using antibiotics. Because the problem with antibiotics is that once you take them, obviously you're completely destroying the gut, and like I mentioned before, you have to then rebuild from scratch. So it's a choice that you have to make, but again, it depends on how much you're suffering and how much you really want to get rid of the problem, and also the cost as well, because some of these antibiotics are expensive if you're doing them privately. In the UK, if you talk to your local GP about sort of treatments for Sibo, some of them won't even recognize it as being a problem, and therefore you have to kind of go down the private route, which is why it makes it more difficult and why it makes it more expensive. But in the US, this could be very different. So for me, I had a round of antibiotics. I used rifaximin, which is the one they recommend for my type of Sibo, and it lasted for 2 weeks, that treatment. Sometimes it can be 1 week, but it depends on the type of Sibo you've got and how strong it was. My levels were so high that my prescribing pharmacist decided to give me 2 weeks instead. So sometimes you might find that, for hydrogen-based Sibo, rifaximin is recommended, but for methane-based, you might get rifaximin and you might get neomycin. So it depends on the type you've got, and again, that will come from your practitioner that you're working with. Herbal antimicrobials also last for around 4 weeks. So again, you've got 2 weeks of using antibiotics, or you can use 4 weeks of antimicrobials. Now, if you are using the herbal method, you may do this for longer. So sometimes I do this for 2 months, 3 months maybe. And again, it can get quite expensive because some of these supplements are very, very expensive. And if you're using them over and over again, the cost can soon mount up. And then the final thing is looking at the elemental diet, which I did mention on my previous video. So that is going to be either replacing 1 or 2 meals, or depending on, again, your strength of your SIBO, you may decide to have it for all your meals for a set period of time, maybe a week. And I'll talk about that on my kind of last slide. So looking at this herbal treatment, this is the herbal treatment that I used in conjunction with my antibiotics, and this was recommended by my practitioner. So this is just what I did. This isn't advice, and it's certainly not medical advice. You should always do your own research and research all these supplements before you start using them. And importantly, if you are taking any drugs, make sure that they do not interact with them and cause any other problems. So that's just a little bit of a side note. Now, one of the things you need to keep in mind, and this is super important, is that when you are going down any protocol, whether that be antimicrobial using plants-based supplements or you're using antibiotics, is that these bacteria don't want to die. And as a result of that, they produce what we call biofilm. So it's almost like a protective layer that stops them being attacked. And so before we even start any of these protocols, we want to try and remove that biofilm. And we do that by using something like a biofilm disruptor. And in this case, the one that I used was KL Interface. Again, it's available on Amazon. I'll leave links to all these things below. But this is really, really important. And I would say for a minimum of at least a week, you want to be taking a biofilm disruptor to make the most out of the supplements that you're going to take and to make the most of the antibiotics if you're going to take any. So that's the first thing that you need to do. And then after that, it's a case of taking a selection of different herbal antimicrobials that may be useful to you. Now, just to note that there's plenty of antimicrobials out there that come in almost like a mixture of all these different things, and you may find that they're useful for you. Now, on my third protocol, I decided that I wanted to take all these things in high dosage. So I took specific milligrams based on what was recommended by my practitioner. So I took berberine, neem, oregano, and allicin, and they were the kind of the main components of my Sibo protocol, because bearing in mind I was also taking antibiotics as well. So berberine, just to note, can actually make you feel a little bit sick if you take too much, and you may find you feel slightly nauseous. You may find that you get stomachache, but it can also give you low blood sugar levels. So if you're someone that suffers with controlling your blood sugar already, you might be diabetic, that may be something to take into account before you start taking berberine. Neem and oregano, again, I didn't really find out had any issues with those. Some people find the taste of oregano, because obviously when you take these supplements, they're incredibly strong, and oregano, especially if you start to burp or you're eating foods or drinking, you may find it comes back up again and can make you feel a little bit sick. But other than that, it's nothing too bad. Allicin's actually a garlic extract, and it's incredibly powerful. Although it's used for Sibo, it's also used for other kind of infections, and is incredibly powerful. So again, something to do your research on. Lauric acid, which is found in coconut oil, can be very, very helpful in assisting with Sibo, and coconut oil in general is antimicrobial and it has an anti kind of bacterial effect, so that can be very, very useful. And maybe if you are doing something like the ketogenic diet, which is a high fat diet, the lauric acid found in coconut oil could be fairly helpful. Another big thing to keep in mind is that while you're doing your protocol, you may get or may feel worse or have worse symptoms before you feel better. Why? Because it's known as a thing called Herxheimer reaction, and it's to do with the fact that we are attacking this bacteria and trying to kill them off. They then release certain toxins that can make you feel sick. So they make you feel sick, they may give you a headache, you may get a rash, you may get diarrhea, you may get all sorts of other symptoms happening before you start to actually feel better, and they can last for a good few weeks. So keep that in mind, is that you may feel worse before you get better, but you want to carry on this protocol as much as you can, because you want to get through that process to get to the other side. So again, guys, this is just my protocol that I used. Do your own research, look into each of these supplements. And I said, there's plenty of supplements out there that contain many of these things that you can buy that may be cheaper for you, but it's worth looking into. And the last thing I want to cover is the elemental diet. Now, this is often overlooked because people think of, well, getting rid of Sibo, you've got to think of the supplements you're taking and antibiotics and antimicrobials, which are all great and really, really important. But obviously, the food that you're consuming during this time can also be just as equally as important as well. And we're trying to support the gut, but we're also trying to minimize the impact of some of the things that we're eating. And obviously, certain foods can be high FODMAP foods, which can obviously irritate Sibo, as I mentioned on the last presentation. So we want to eat low FODMAP foods, but sometimes it's not always possible and it may be difficult. And this is where something like the elemental diet can come into its own, because it stops you from having to think about what you're eating and allows you to go towards these drinks that provide you with the relevant nutrients you need and also reduce that inflammation and stop sending fuel to the fire as such. Now, I've tried both of these drinks, and depending on which country you live in, it will make it, could define the choice that you use. So, for example, the one on the left-hand side, the Elemental here by Dr. Rusco, is an American-based product, and I had to order this from the US, and it is a very, very good product. It tastes really, really good. But unfortunately, it's quite expensive, and you'll find that with most elemental drinks, that they're very, very expensive. And what made this even worse for me was I had to pay tax on this when it landed in the UK as well. So unfortunately for me, it wasn't something that I could continue to use, and I needed to look for an alternative. But if you're in the States, check this out, because I think it's a great drink. It tastes really good. And I just found it was one of the best. Well, it was the best one that I used. Now, as a result of that expense, I then turned to something that I could get in the UK that didn't have to pay, expensive shipping for and taxes on. And that was this one by Integrative Therapeutics. And this, again, was a big bag that I got, and again, fairly expensive. It was well over £100, and it tasted pretty good. But it was nowhere as near as good as the Elemental Heal. So it wasn't something. The Integrative Therapeutics one tasted okay. I wouldn't say I liked in drinking it, but these are things that you effectively have to sip over the period of a almost 2-hour period. So you don't just drink it in one go. You sip these drinks and give your body a chance to absorb them. And they're actually pre-digested. So the proteins in them are pre-digested. So it's very, very easy for you to break down, very, very easy for you to absorb. So if you are sort of, malnourished as such, these are great drinks to use to give your body the nutrients that they need. So it's something worth looking into. And if you've got very, very kind of extreme SIBO and it's simply not shifting, you might find switching to something like an elemental diet could be the thing that helps you move into that kind of feeling better, reducing some of your symptoms. But it's something, you need to research and look into what options work for you. So that is it, guys. That is kind of my overall view on, the treatments that I used. You need to do your research and find out what's going to work for you. But I'll leave links to everything that I've talked about today, and I hope you find that information useful to you. Sibo, I said, it's a very, very difficult thing to remove, and it's very frustrating, but you can do it. I said, for myself, it took me 3 attempts, but on my 3rd attempt, it worked very well, and I feel really, really good now, and all my symptoms have pretty much faded away. So what I need to do now is make sure that I maintain that protocol of actually taking things like HCl, making sure that I'm taking antimicrobials every now and again just to keep them from coming back and keeping that SIBO at bay. If you found this video useful, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments if you have got SIBO and what you use, and I'll catch you on the next video.